In 1922, Eva Taylor, accompanied by her husband Clarence Williams, entered the studio and recorded a really good version of I Wish I Could Shimmy Like My Sister Kate. Now, this record is not particularly difficult to find. What is much tougher is the test pressing. We're going to talk about test pressings, the different types, and the allure today on the 78 RPM channel. Hello, and welcome to the 78 RPM channel. Whether you're new to 78s or an advanced collector, this is your source for information, research, and music about 78 RPM records, cylinders, and radio transcriptions. Hey gang, welcome to the 78 RPM channel. First things first, what is a test pressing? Well, it's kind of what it says it is. It is a pressing that was meant to test something. It was generally made by the manufacturer or the record company in order to test the quality of a disc, maybe check for defects in the stamper, or sometimes to ascertain which of multiple takes were the best in terms of how they sounded on a pressed disc. Some people think that there was only one copy of each test pressing made, and that's simply not true. They are scarce, but if you check different sources, generally between 2 and 20 test pressings were made of any given disc. Let's just say an average of about 10. So that means they're not unique, but they are pretty scarce. And if you're looking for a test pressing for a specific disc, good luck. You're looking for something that probably existed only in a handful of copies. A lot of people think that test pressing is a test pressing is a test pressing. But I've been through a lot of test pressings. These are the test pressings behind me on the shelves, and I've identified what I think are 5 different levels of test pressings that exist. And we're going to talk about them starting with level 1. So what is a level 1 test pressing? A level 1 test pressing is a test pressing. It is a test pressing containing material exactly as it was issued to the public. A good example would be this copy of OK 4740 by Eva Taylor that I showed you before. The information on this disc, the music, and all the little information etched into the runout area, it is exactly the same as you would have received if you had purchased the issued copy of the disc, which I also showed you earlier. While we're here, just a quick tip for those of you who are relatively new collectors. For some reason, 78 RPM collectors like to abbreviate things. The most obvious of this is probably calling the original Dixieland Jazz Band the ODJB, a sin of which I am guilty. But the same carries on to longer titles. The title of this is I Wish I Could Shimmy Like My Sister Kate. In fact, the full title is written out on the label of the release version, but you will find that a lot of collectors abbreviate it and just refer to this song as Sister Kate. Level number 2. Now, the second level of test pressings are really, in a way, more of a novelty than anything else because the material was still issued to the public, just in different forms. The first of these, unreleased couplings. Now, this is Joseph Smith's Music Masters performing Lonely Eyes with Arthur Hall on the vocal. The other side, Joseph Smith's Music Masters performing Sunday. Now, both of these records were released by Grey Gull. Sunday was released on Grey Gull 1408. Lonely Eyes was released on Grey Gull 1409. So, you can get both of these songs, both of these performances, both of these takes without any trouble. But you can't get them on the same disc, which is why this is a level 2 test pressing. The second type of level 2 test pressing was most frequently used by Edison, making Edison diamond discs, and that is the double take pressing. This is an Edison diamond disc of Poor Man's Blues by Frankie Marvin. The reason that this is different than what was released to the public? Both sides are the same song, they're just different takes. If you know anything about Edison, you know that he would release multiple takes of the same song with the same catalog number. So both of these takes were made available to the general public. If you buy a copy of Edison 52490, you might get either of these. But if you want both takes on the same disc, you're going to have to find a test pressing. The third level of test pressing is where they make a big jump in terms of desirability for collectors, because from this point forward, they will feature content content that was not sold to the general public. This is a copy of Cleo Brown performing Pinetop's Boogie Woogie, the Boogie Woogie piano piece written by Clarence Pinetop Smith. Now, this was released in 1935 on Decca number 477. And while you can get a copy of this, what you cannot get is a copy of this take. Take 1 was released on 477. This is take 2. So while this record is a fairly common 1935 release, this take is not. And once you start getting into unissued takes, that's where the interest jumps up for collectors. Because if you want this performance, at least before the advent of reissue CDs, your only way to get this performance was to find somebody who had one of the handful of test pressings. Level 4 test pressings take things one step further. This is Viola McCoy with Fletcher Henderson's Jazz 6. They're performing a version of It Makes No Difference Now. Not only was this an unissued take, but none of the takes of this song from this session were released. If you want to hear a copy of Viola McCoy with Fletcher Henderson's Jazz 6 performing It Makes No Difference Now, as recorded in this session, good luck. There are exactly 2 copies known to exist. One copy is the original Brunswick file copy. Now, that copy was possibly, maybe, supposedly, allegedly, maybe, somehow, possibly removed from the Brunswick Library archives at some point, and that ended up in someone's collection many, many years ago. Now, that copy eventually ended up in the archive of a university over in England, which means it will never be heard again. Don't get me started on what happens to rare discs when they end up at universities who do not have the capability of making those things available to the public. It makes me mad. That means if you want to hear a copy of this, it exists here. This is the only copy in private hands as far as we know, and maybe the only one that wasn't allegedly pilfered. Interestingly enough, if you look at the bottom, it says 2625 at the bottom. That is the catalog number that Brunswick was originally going to issue this disc on, an issue that was never made. Brunswick 2625 was never released. Before we go to the final level of test pressings, I'd like to give a heads up, especially to the newer collectors. If you go online, you will sometimes see auctions or sales for things that say vinyl test pressing. Now, these are very often rare or at least scarce and valuable material from the 1920s and 1930s. But something you need to know, those are not actual test pressings. I have copies of several of these and they sound amazing. An original stamper pressed onto vinyl material is going to sound great, but it is not an original test pressing. If you see something that was issued in the 20s or 30s and the pressing is on vinyl, it is not original. The history behind some of these, especially the ones that were made by Columbia and the companies that Columbia owned, sketchy at best. There is a rumor, and we're just going to go with rumor, allegedly, I think is the word that I'm supposed to use. A wealthy collector subsidized the stamping of these items late at night during overnight shifts, and those were eventually, allegedly, smuggled out of the building and made available to that collector. Eventually, they just kind of dispersed their way through the hobby. So yes, they sound amazing. I have some of the best sounding 78 you're ever going to hear, but they're not original test pressings. That brings us to level 5 of the test pressing ladder. Now let's quickly recap. A test pressing level 1, that's a test pressing. Test pressing level 2 would be a test pressing where the material was available to the public, just not in that form. For instance, a pressing with 2 takes, one on each side, or what we call an unissued coupling. Level number 3 is a test pressing where there is unissued material, an unissued take. that is on that test pressing, meaning it was not available to members of the general public. Level 4 is a test pressing that contains a song that was not issued. So none of the takes of that song from a given session were issued. Not only can you not get a specific take, you could not get a specific song. And that leads us to level 5, which is unissued everything. This is an 11.5-inch test pressing by Jeanette. You can tell it's by Jeanette, first of all, because it is ridiculously thick for a 78 RPM record that is not a diamond disc. In fact, it is almost diamond disc thick. Secondly, it does have these concentric rings on the back, which are raised. In fact, they are raised almost to the same thickness as a regular 78. And so between the thick pressing and the concentric raised rings, this is a very heavy and very thick test pressing. The record itself is Doug Papard and his orchestra performing I Want to Sing About You. Now, Doug Papard and his orchestra made 2 recordings for Jeanette. No records by Doug Papard and his orchestra, or Doug Papard's orchestra, or Doug Papard's Northwestern Orchestra, or Doug Papard's Northwesterners were ever issued. It is a test pressing of an unissued take of an unissued song by a group that never had an issue. Everything about this record was unreleased, and that's why it is a level 5 test pressing. If you have found test pressings in the wild, legitimately in the wild, not from an auction site, not from eBay, let us know in the comments what they are, because somebody may be looking for that. And a test pressing that somebody's looking for is probably worth a little bit more than the normal public release of that record that somebody might be looking for. Let us know what you found in the comments below. Keep looking for records, and we will see you next time on the 78 RPM channel.